Have you ever felt lost, like there's no way out, as if you're carrying an invisible weight that no one around you can understand? Imagine someone who faced exactly that, hitting rock bottom, yet found the strength to rise again. In this video, you'll witness Jack's inspiring journey, a story of struggle, support, and resilience that shows that even in the darkest days, there's always a spark of hope. Watch now and discover how friendship, therapy, and faith transformed Jack's life. If you've been through something similar or know someone who is, this story could make all the difference. Jack Thompson had always been the kind of person others admired. In his early 30s, he seemed to have achieved what many aspire to, a promising career in marketing, loyal friends, and a lifestyle that others envied. His colleagues saw him as a success story, and his family took pride in his accomplishments, almost like a trophy to showcase at family gatherings. Jack's routine was busy, but he believed that this was normal for someone aiming for more. But beneath the surface, something was starting to crack. The pressures at work were intensifying, and challenges were stacking up without pause. He noticed that his mind was increasingly crowded with a constant noise, thoughts that never quieted. These were internal demands, reminders of past failures that, even though minor, echoed as if they were monumental. Still, Jack paid little attention, telling himself it was just part of the process, that fatigue was temporary, and he just needed to hang in there a little longer. The first changes began subtly. Jack started to lose interest in activities that once energized him. His morning run, which had been sacred to him, began to be postponed, and soon he stopped altogether. His hobbies also lost their appeal, turning into a burden he avoided. Outings with friends, once a welcome break in his week, became obligations he preferred to escape. His friends noticed the change and tried to reach out, but Jack always masked it with a smile. He was skilled at concealing his struggles, always claiming he was just a bit tired. Even to himself, it was easier to pretend everything was fine than to confront the growing emotions within. The signs intensified. Jack started feeling an unusual exhaustion that even sleep couldn't dispel. In the mornings, getting out of bed felt like an act of bravery. Even when he did sleep, his mind never rested. He would wake up already feeling the weight of the new day. Anxiety became a constant, and fleeting thoughts about the meaning of his life became persistent and uncomfortable. In moments of introspection, he wondered how long he could keep up the facade. But Jack insisted on carrying on. The pressure at work continued, and he believed that showing any weakness could ruin his reputation. He began avoiding messages from friends, coming up with excuses to justify his absence. Deep down, he felt that no one would understand what he was going through. The sensation of being in free fall, growing more distant from his former life, became more real with each passing day. And so, without realizing it, Jack found himself on a path that seemed irreversible, gradually isolating himself while the invisible weight of depression consumed him, like a shadow he could no longer ignore. Jack was sinking deeper, as if caught in a whirlpool pulling him into the depths where light seemed unreachable. The feeling of tiredness had turned into something heavier and darker. He didn't just feel exhausted, it was as though an invisible weight pressed on his chest, making each breath a painful effort. Days blended together in a confusing sequence of purposeless hours, and Jack no longer cared what the next day would bring. Work, which had once been the center of his life, was now unbearable. He arrived at the office with a blank expression, greeting colleagues with a brief, distant nod. The enthusiasm, the spark in his eyes that had once defined him, had completely disappeared. Projects that used to ignite his motivation now seemed like insurmountable barriers. His focus slipped through his mind like sand through fingers, leaving him unfocused, scattered, and with a void where once vibrant ideas had thrived. The pressures at work began to build up, and Jack no longer had the energy to respond. He isolated himself at his desk, pretending to be busy, but in reality, spent hours staring at the screen with an empty mind, as if he were in some kind of trance. The feeling of failure began to erode his confidence, and thoughts of inadequacy dominated him. He questioned how he'd gotten this far and why any effort now seemed in vain. Gradually, the isolation at work started to spill over into his personal life. Friends tried to reach out, but Jack avoided responding to their messages. Partly, he didn't want to worry anyone, but mostly, he felt he didn't have the strength to explain what even he didn't fully understand. He stopped attending gatherings and turned down invitations with excuses that sounded cold and distant. Solitude became his only company, and ironically, it felt more comforting than any conversation. At home, the scene was no different. His daily routines gradually disintegrated. His disciplined eating habits now became neglected. Jack went days without eating properly, surviving on quick, tasteless meals, with no joy at all. The environment around him reflected his inner state. Dishes piled up, clothes scattered on the floor, a sense of disarray that he could no longer organize. Days became monotonous, but the nights were even worse. Sleep, once a welcomed escape, was now just another struggle. Jack lay in bed staring at the ceiling for hours, his thoughts spiraling into negativity and self-criticism. The rare moments of rest were interrupted by nightmares and sudden awakenings, leaving him even more drained in the morning. The psychological exhaustion began to manifest as physical pain. Jack started feeling inexplicable aches, a stiffness in his muscles that seemed to come out of nowhere. He avoided mirrors, fearing to see the image of someone he no longer recognized. The unkempt appearance, the deep circles under his eyes, the pale skin, all these signs made him feel ashamed, pushing him to hide even further from the world. More and more, his home became a kind of cell where he stayed isolated, wrapped in a sadness that seemed impenetrable. Deep down, Jack began to struggle with thoughts he had never imagined. He wondered if any of it was worth it, if he would ever feel anything besides that constant pain again. The idea of giving up appeared more frequently, whispering in his mind as a final escape from suffering. Each day was an invisible battle, faced in silence, without anyone around him aware of his anguish. In this spiral, Jack began to realize that he no longer looked forward to the morning, that each dawn only marked another stage in an unbearable cycle. He kept his phone off, ignored the doorbell, and distanced himself further from any possibility of connection. Amid this self-imposed isolation, the feeling of abandonment was nearly unbearable, yet at the same time, he felt that any attempt by others to approach him would only add to his burden. When his parents called, he pretended to be busy, avoiding answering. His brother tried to visit him, but when Jack saw his car arriving through the window, he turned off the lights and waited in silence until he left. Somewhere in his mind, Jack knew that this behavior was unhealthy, but the thought of opening up his suffering to someone else left him paralyzed. He believed no one would understand what he was going through, that his pain was too overwhelming to be shared. One particularly dark night, as he looked at his reflection in the window's glass, Jack barely recognized the man he saw. In the depths of his eyes, there was an endless sadness, a loss of identity he didn't know how to recover. He realized he had reached the lowest point in his life, where even hope seemed distant, almost unreal. It was an absolute loneliness, and he feared he might never find a way back. While Jack continued to isolate himself, someone was growing increasingly worried about his absence. Ben, a friend from college and one of the few people who truly knew him beyond appearances. Ben was one of those people who could notice subtle changes in his friend's behavior, and although time and life's demands had distanced them, something in his gut told him that Jack wasn't okay. After weeks of unanswered messages, Ben decided to show up at Jack's house, determined to see what was really going on. When the doorbell rang, Jack hesitated before opening it. He wondered what Ben would think upon seeing him like this, in a state where he barely recognized himself. But finally, he relented and opened the door, looking disoriented. Seeing his friend, Ben instantly realized that something was seriously wrong. Jack looked pale, visibly tired, with a lost look in his eyes. Nevertheless, Ben hid his surprise and gave a warm, welcoming smile, trying to keep things lighthearted. "Jack, I thought you'd forgotten about us old friends," Ben said, feigning a casual tone. Jack forced a smile and tried to deflect with a vague excuse about work and exhaustion, but Ben wasn't fooled. He knew he had to be subtle so as not to scare Jack off, so he suggested they have a coffee on the couch, keeping the environment casual. They sat down and Ben, without pressuring him, started a lighthearted conversation, talking about life, memories from their college days, and trivial stories, creating a warm and welcoming atmosphere. As the conversation progressed, Ben gently shifted the topic toward Jack's well-being. "Man, you look exhausted. You know you can count on me for anything, right?" He chose his words carefully, trying to break through the wall that Jack seemed to have built around himself. Jack looked away, fiddling with his coffee cup, visibly uncomfortable, but something in Ben's words made him lower his guard, if only for a moment. Jack sighed, as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore, Ben," he murmured, almost in a whisper. It was the first time in weeks that he'd voiced his suffering aloud, and even those simple words felt like a revelation. Ben listened silently, feeling the gravity of the moment, and responded with a calm, encouraging tone. "Jack, no one has to go through this alone. I know it's hard, but there are ways to ease the burden," Ben said, choosing each word carefully, expressing genuine understanding and support. He gently suggested that Jack consider professional help, mentioning therapy naturally, as something common and accessible. Seeing his friend's hesitant expression, he added, "You don't have to make any decisions right now. I just want you to know that I'm here, whatever your next step is." That conversation planted a seed in Jack, small but real. For the first time in a long time, he felt understood, and Ben's simple presence seemed to bring a bit of light to the darkness surrounding him. Before leaving, Ben hugged him, reinforcing that he was available anytime. After his friend left, Jack stood by the door, reflecting on Ben's words. He knew he was still far from any solution, but that unexpected gesture of support left a mark, stirring a small spark of hope. That night, Ben's words echoed in Jack's mind, a reminder that he wasn't completely alone. And even though he wasn't fully sure how or when, something inside Jack was beginning to change. He didn't know if he would have the strength to seek help immediately, but Ben's presence served as a reminder that perhaps, just maybe, there was a way out of the pit he was in. After Ben's visit, something had shifted in Jack's mind, even if only slightly. His friend's words resonated with him, and the idea of seeking professional help no longer seemed so out of reach. But taking that step felt monumental. He was afraid of confronting his own thoughts, of exposing his vulnerabilities to a stranger. Still, Ben's presence had shown him that perhaps he didn't have to face this struggle alone. Days passed before he finally scheduled his first appointment. That morning, sitting in the waiting room, Jack felt his heart racing, his hands trembling. He had never been to a therapist's office before, and the idea of talking about his feelings was terrifying. When he was called in, he slowly stood up and followed into the office, taking a seat in a comfortable chair that felt awkward because of the context. Dr. Emily Harris greeted him with a calm and welcoming smile, introducing herself in a friendly manner. Her voice was soothing, the environment was comforting, and she led the conversation gently, allowing Jack to settle in before asking any deep questions. After a few minutes, Jack finally began to open up, although hesitantly. He spoke about his exhaustion, the weight he felt every day, and the difficulty of finding meaning in life. In the first few sessions, Jack felt as though he wasn't making any progress. Each time he opened up, he felt exposed, almost too vulnerable. He feared judgment, even though Dr. Harris showed respect and empathy for everything he shared. With each question she asked, he wrestled with an internal resistance that tried to block his answers. Despite this, something within him pushed him to keep going, even if only little by little. One day, during a session, Dr. Harris asked him to describe his daily routine and the thoughts that emerged with each activity. Reluctantly, Jack started to talk, describing how each task felt meaningless and how a sense of emptiness infiltrated everything he did. Listening, Dr. Harris guided him to reflect on when these feelings had first appeared. He tried to recall, searching through memories until he found a starting point, a time when life had still made sense. Over the following weeks, Jack realized that therapy wasn't a magical solution, it was a process. He learned that he needed to confront painful memories, deal with the pressures he had internalized over the years, and most importantly, accept that he didn't have all the answers. It was hard, sometimes overwhelming, but little by little, he began to understand that the path to recovery required patience. One of his first victories came when Dr. Harris introduced a thought recording technique. She asked Jack to write down each negative thought that came up, without filtering, and then analyze if these thoughts were truly as absolute as they seemed. Initially, he found the idea strange and uncomfortable. "What's the point of writing down something that's already in my head?" he questioned. But with her encouragement, he decided to give it a try. As he practiced the exercise, Jack discovered that the thoughts he carried with him weren't always true. Many were born from exaggerated self-criticism and unrealistic expectations. He began to notice patterns. He constantly pushed himself, feeling inadequate in countless situations without real reason. This realization, though still budding, brought him a momentary relief, as if part of the weight he carried was beginning to be understood. As sessions went on, Jack also started setting small goals with Dr. Harris's help, like resuming a few activities he had abandoned. They weren't grand achievements, but slowly he managed to go out for short walks and even read a book he had set aside. These were tiny steps, yet each one represented a victory. Although he still had doubts and moments when he wanted to quit, Jack understood that therapy was a tool allowing him to see the world from a new perspective. Dr. Harris didn't give him ready-made answers but offered the right questions, those that helped him explore the complexity of his emotions. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt that he might find his way back to himself. At the end of each session, Jack left with a mixed sense of relief and exhaustion, as if he had fought an inner battle. But this time, he knew he wasn't alone. Ben was by his side, even from afar, and now, with Dr. Harris's support, Jack began to believe that, perhaps, recovery was possible one small step at a time. In the midst of the therapeutic process, something unexpected awakened in Jack. During one of the sessions, Dr. Harris mentioned the importance of finding sources of comfort and meaning, especially in times of deep pain. She suggested that he try different ways of connecting with himself, whether through meditation, reflection, or even spirituality. The idea planted a seed, though Jack didn't yet know what to do with it. The following week, while walking through a nearby park, Jack found himself drawn to a small used bookstall. Browsing absent-mindedly through the shelves, his eyes landed on a title that made him stop. The book talked about finding purpose and inner peace in difficult times, blending spiritual teachings with reflections on life. Without much thought, he decided to buy it. That night, as he flipped through the first few pages, something inside Jack began to calm. The words were simple, yet they carried a depth he hadn't felt in a long time. The author spoke of the value of faith, not as rigid belief, but as a connection to something greater, something that drives us forward when everything seems lost. Although skeptical, Jack realized that those words brought him a kind of comfort he hadn't experienced since beginning his journey. Each night, he read a little more, taking notes and reflecting on passages that resonated most with him. Without noticing, he began incorporating some of the practices suggested in the book, like writing down small daily gratitudes or spending a few minutes in silence, just breathing and trying to disconnect from his worries. These moments became precious pauses in his routine, fragments of peace amidst the turmoil that still consumed him. Gradually, Jack opened up to this new way of seeing life. He didn't consider himself religious, but he began to see spirituality as something personal, a way to cultivate hope and inner strength. One night, as he reflected on what he had read, he felt something new, a faint sense of gratitude. It was a quiet, almost timid feeling, but it was real. He felt thankful not for a perfect life, but for the support he now had from Ben, from Dr. Harris, and from a budding faith that was beginning to illuminate his days. Over time, Jack began attending a small spiritual support group that met once a week in a local event room. There, he found people with varied stories, each seeking their own way to find comfort and resilience. Jack felt welcomed, and the weekly conversations provided him with a connection he thought he had lost. In this spiritual journey, Jack discovered something essential. Hope didn't lie in easy answers, but in the power to keep moving forward, one step at a time. Although he still had a long way to go, he felt he was finally starting to see a new light in his life, something that had seemed impossible for so long. As days passed, Jack began to feel small but significant changes. Therapy, his readings, and moments of introspection were slowly transforming his state of mind. For the first time in months, he woke up with a slight sense of purpose. Although the pain was still there, something within him felt stronger. Now, he had small goals he set for himself, modest steps that represented his commitment to recovery. One of these steps was to resume his morning walks. Initially, each outing felt like a chore, but the fresh air and the simple act of observing the city brought unexpected comfort. Jack started to appreciate these moments, using them to clear his mind and organize his thoughts. During his walks, he would revisit some of the conversations with Dr. Harris, applying the observation techniques he had learned in therapy. Little by little, the world around him felt more alive, and he began to feel part of it again. Additionally, Jack decided to revive an old hobby, photography. His camera, forgotten for so long, was rediscovered with a fresh perspective. He began photographing small details of the city, scenes he used to overlook. Reflections of trees and puddles, a stranger's smile, old architecture contrasting with new, each image seemed to capture pieces of beauty that he hadn't noticed before. Through his lens, Jack found a way to express his emotions, capturing moments that made him feel connected and present. The impact of these small victories also showed in his relationships. Ben, his friend, noticed the gradual change and couldn't have been happier. Seeing Jack's enthusiasm as he talked about photography, Ben offered to join him on one of his walks, and together, they rediscovered the city where they had spent so much time. This outing brought them closer, and Jack realized how much he valued Ben's presence in his life. Their friendship, once weakened by distance, was now being renewed with a strength he hadn't expected. The strengthening of this friendship motivated him to reconnect with other people. Jack began replying to messages from friends he had ignored during his darkest moments. Initially, he felt nervous, fearing that no one would understand what he had been through. But, surprisingly, his friends welcomed him with open arms. There were emotional reunions filled with laughter and memories, and Jack realized just how much he had missed these connections. Another significant transformation was the way he approached work. The pressure no longer suffocated him as it once had. Now, he allowed himself to take breaks, spread out his tasks, and respect his own limits. By sharing responsibilities and accepting that he didn't need to be perfect, Jack found a balance that had once seemed impossible. He reconnected with his creativity and began to find joy in the small victories of everyday life. One day, while organizing his workspace, Jack found a note left by Dr. Harris after a difficult session. Healing is not a destination, but a journey. Appreciate each step, even the small ones. He smiled as those words perfectly captured what he was living. Throughout his journey, he had learned that happiness wasn't a permanent state, but something he could cultivate, moment by moment, with patience and acceptance. Now, Jack could see that ups and downs were part of the process. He had stopped searching for absolute answers and embraced the possibility of an imperfect but meaningful life. The world around him, with all its complexities, felt less threatening and more welcoming. He had learned to forgive himself, to accept his vulnerabilities, and most importantly, to celebrate his achievements, however small. At the end of that day, Jack felt a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. He knew there would still be challenges ahead, but now he had the confidence to face them. His rebirth hadn't been a grand event but a series of small gestures, of moments that brought him back to himself. The journey was far from over, but Jack knew that with each step, he was closer to the peace he had been seeking. Jack watched the evening sky, absorbing every detail of the landscape before him. After everything he had faced, this simple moment held special meaning. He reflected on the journey that had transformed him, a series of small steps that had brought him back to himself. It hadn't been a quick or easy process, but each obstacle had deepened his understanding of life and what truly mattered. He thought of all the people who had been by his side: Ben, who had never given up on supporting him, Dr. Harris, whose guidance had seen him through the darkest days, and the support group, where he had found a renewed sense of belonging. Jack realized that his healing wasn't something he'd achieved solely on his own strength but through the love and presence of those around him. With a lighter heart, he smiled as he recalled the daily achievements and the moments of peace he could now cultivate. He understood that his recovery was an ongoing journey and that, like everyone, he would have both good and bad days. But now, unlike before, he knew he could face challenges without sinking into despair. As he left the park, Jack felt a quiet certainty that happiness was built in fragments. in moments of connection and gratitude. He walked with confidence, knowing that as long as there was hope, he could continue to be reborn day after day. Jack had, at last, found his way back to life. If this story touched you in any way, don't forget to show your support. Like the video, leave a comment sharing what inspired you the most, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message of hope. Your engagement helps this story reach more people and could make all the difference in someone's life. Thank you for watching and for being part of this journey.